The morning of February 13th, 1943. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh stood beside his Corsair, number 576, running his hand along the inverted gull wing. The paint was barely weathered. His squadron, Marine Fighting Squadron 124, had arrived just yesterday, their dozen F4U Corsairs, the first of their kind to reach combat in the Pacific. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Walsh had logged exactly 25 hours in the type. Today they would escort B-24 Liberators to Kahili Airfield on Bougainville, 160 miles up the slot, deep into Japanese-held territory. The pre-flight briefing had been rushed. Intelligence estimated enemy fighter strength at Kahili at 50 or more zeros. The American strike package would include P-38 Lightnings, P-40 Warhawks, and Walsh's untested Corsairs. What Walsh did not know, could not know, was that in 12 months he would become the first Corsair ace. That by war's end, pilots like him would achieve an 11-to-1 kill ratio against Japanese aircraft. That some Japanese pilots would come to regard the Corsair as the most formidable American fighter they had faced. But on this Valentine's Day morning, climbing into his cockpit for his first combat mission in the type, Walsh knew only that he was flying a machine his own Navy had rejected as too dangerous for carrier operations. A machine the Marines inherited not because anyone believed it would revolutionize air combat, but because they needed something, anything, with the range and power to reach the Japanese strongholds up the island chain. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine roared to life, all 2,000 horses of it. The sound was different from the Wildcat Walsh had flown before, deeper, more menacing. Through the intakes mounted in the wing roots, air rushed at high speed, creating a distinctive moan that would later earn the Corsair a nickname among Japanese forces, Whistling Death. But on February 13th, 1943, there was no legend yet, only 12 pilots in unfamiliar machines, heading into the teeth of Japanese air power, about to participate in what would be remembered as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. By the time Walsh landed back at Henderson Field that afternoon, 2 of his squadron mates were dead. 8 American fighters had been lost in total. The Japanese had suffered minimal casualties. It was a disaster, the kind of combat debut that should have ended the Corsair's Pacific career before it began. Instead, it marked the beginning of a transformation that would reshape the Pacific Air War. To understand what happened next requires understanding not just an airplane, but a collision of expectations with reality that mirrored the larger transformation occurring across the Pacific theater. The Japanese pilots who climbed to meet those first Corsairs over Kahili carried with them years of combat experience, honed in China and perfected in the early months of the Pacific War. They flew the Mitsubishi A6M0, a fighter that had dominated every adversary it encountered. Its legendary maneuverability, its ability to outturn any American fighter, had become an article of faith for both sides. American fighter doctrine in early 1943 still bore the scars of those early defeats. The Wildcat pilots who defended Guadalcanal had learned brutal lessons about engaging Zeros in turning fights. Survive by diving away, use your superior speed, never, ever try to turn with them. The Zero's lightweight and exceptional wing loading made it supreme in the slow-speed dogfight that had defined air combat since the First World War. The F4U Corsair arrived in the Pacific carrying expectations shaped by that doctrine. It was fast, certainly. The prototype had exceeded 400 miles per hour in level flight back in 1940, making it the first American single-engine fighter to break that barrier. But carrier trials had revealed a machine with dangerous stall characteristics, poor visibility, and a tendency to bounce when it hit the deck. The U.S. Navy, already receiving the more docile Grumman F-6F Hellcat, made its choice. The Hellcat went to carriers. The Corsair went to the Marines, for land-based operations only. This decision, made for purely pragmatic reasons, would inadvertently create the conditions for the Corsair's success. Marine squadrons in the South Pacific needed fighters with range. The distances from Guadalcanal to Japanese bases at Bougainville, Rabaul, and beyond exceeded the Wildcat's capabilities. Only the P-38 Lightning and the Corsair could provide the necessary reach. But while the Lightning was faster in straight-line speed, the Corsair offered something else. It was a fighter, through and through, designed from the beginning for air superiority. The design philosophy behind the Corsair began in 1938, when the Bureau of Aeronautics issued a request for a single-engine fighter capable of speeds no American carrier fighter had achieved. Vort's chief engineer, Rex Beisel, approached the problem with ruthless pragmatism. Build the smallest possible airframe around the most powerful available engine. That engine was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial producing 1,850 horsepower in its initial variant. By the time production F4U reached squadrons, that figure had increased to 2,000 horses. The engineering challenge was immediate: how to mount a propeller large enough to absorb that power without requiring impossibly long landing gear. The solution became the Corsair's most recognizable feature. The inverted gull wing, dipping sharply at the wing root before angling upward, allowed a 13-foot 4-inch propeller adequate ground clearance while keeping the landing gear relatively short. It was an aesthetic accident. The bent-wing bird was bent purely for function. But function bred consequences. The massive engine and long nose pushed the cockpit aft, 14 feet behind the propeller. In the F4U-1 that VM F124 flew on February 14, 1943, forward visibility from the birdcage canopy was severely limited. On carrier approaches, pilots literally could not see the landing signals officer once they lined up with the deck. Add to this the Corsair's wicked stall behavior, the tendency for one wing to drop without warning at low speed, and the bouncing that occurred when those long oleo struts hit the deck, and the Navy's decision made perfect sense. What made less sense to the Japanese pilots climbing to intercept that first combat mission was the airplane they were seeing. Wildcats, they knew. P-40s and P-38s, they knew. This new fighter, with its strange bent wings and massive nose, was unknown. In the combat that followed, the Japanese relied on tactics that had worked for 2 years. Bait the Americans into turning fights, use the Zero's superior low-speed maneuverability to get guns on target. The Corsairs that day flew like wildcats, because their pilots flew them like wildcats, because that was all anyone knew. The 8 aircraft lost on Valentine's Day included 2 Corsairs. One died in a mid-air collision with a Zero, both pilots killed. It was the Corsair's first confirmed kill, achieved through mutual destruction. The other went down to enemy fire. Back at Henderson Field, VMF 124's pilots and ground crews faced the grim arithmetic of combat. If this was the best the new fighter could do, if 2 of 12 fell in a single mission, the mathematics were unsustainable. Major William Geese, commanding officer of VMF 124, gathered his pilots that evening. The debriefing was detailed. What worked, what didn't, where the Corsair's performance had surprised them, where Japanese tactics had succeeded. Slowly, tentatively, a different picture began to emerge. The Corsairs had been fast, noticeably faster than the Zeros in level flight and in the dive. When Walsh and the other pilots had broken off combat, diving away as Wildcat doctrine demanded, the Zeros had not caught them. In fact, the Zeros had not even attempted pursuit once the Corsairs committed to the dive, and when the Americans had needed to climb back to altitude to rejoin their formation, the Corsairs had outclimbed everything in the sky. These advantages, speed and climb rate, were not small margins. The production F4U-1 had a top speed of 446 miles per hour. The Zero, in its A6M third variant, then in service, topped out at 346 miles per hour, a 100-mile-per-hour advantage. In climb rate, the early Corsairs managed 3,250 feet per minute, the Zero about 2,600, a meaningful but not overwhelming advantage. What was overwhelming was firepower. Each Corsair mounted 6 Browning M250 caliber machine guns in the wings, outside the propeller arc. No synchronization gear, no loss of rate of fire. 390 rounds per gun. The combined weight of fire from those 6 guns was approximately 96 pounds per minute. A 2-second burst put 32 pounds of projectiles into the target. The Zero, unarmored and without self-sealing fuel tanks, could not withstand such punishment. Japanese pilots had grown accustomed to absorbing hits from the Wildcat's .450 calibers. The Corsair's firepower represented a 50% increase, but between the Valentine's Day mission and the innovations that would follow lay a month of relative inactivity. Japanese forces had evacuated Guadalcanal on February 7th. The evacuation meant fewer large-scale air battles. VMF 124 flew patrols, escort missions, training flights. They worked with their ground crews to understand the Corsair's systems, its quirks, its strengths, and they talked among themselves, comparing notes, building a body of knowledge about how to fight in the new aircraft. Kenneth Walsh, the former enlisted pilot who had logged over 2,000 hours before receiving his commission, was particularly methodical. He studied the Japanese tactics he had observed. He analyzed the moments in combat when the Corsair's speed had created opportunities. He listened to other pilots, to the Army P-38 jockeys who had been fighting longer, to the Navy bomber pilots who had watched air combat from their gunner positions. Altitude, Walsh concluded, was paramount. The Corsair climbed well. It could reach 20,000 feet faster than a Zero could, and at altitude, the Americans could choose when and how to engage. They could dive on Japanese formations, use their speed to close, fire their superior armament, and break away before the more maneuverable Zeros could bring their guns to bear. Stay fast, stay high, control the geometry of the engagement. It was not revolutionary tactics. Boom and zoom had been understood since the First World War. But it was revolutionary for Marine pilots who had spent months in Wildcats, where altitude advantages eroded quickly because the Zero could outclimb you, where breaking away meant hoping your dive speed exceeded the Zero's for long enough to escape. The Corsair changed the equation. In a Corsair, you could not just escape. You could reset, climb back up, position yourself for another attack, dictate the terms of combat. The opportunity to test these evolving tactics came on April 1, 1943. Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor, launched Operation I-Go Sakusen, a 2-week air offensive designed to destroy Allied air power in the Solomons. After months of relative quiet, the skies over the Russells and Guadalcanal filled with Japanese aircraft again. Walsh was on patrol over the Russell Islands when his flight encountered enemy aircraft. Not Zeros this time, but bombers with fighter escort. Walsh dove on the formation. His tactics were precise. Build speed in the dive. Close to gun range. Short burst into the bomber. Break away before the escorting fighters could react. Climb back to altitude. Reset. Attack again. He shot down 3 aircraft that day. The first Corsair ace was born not from extended dogfights, but from disciplined application of the airplane's fundamental advantages. Speed to control engagement range, climb rate to maintain altitude superiority, firepower to kill quickly. It was warfare transformed by machinery, by the brute application of horsepower and engineering to the problems of aerial combat. But Walsh's success on April 1st was individual, not systematic. Other VMF 124 pilots scored victories that day, but they were still learning, still adapting. The squadron as a whole was discovering that the Corsair demanded different thinking. You could not fly it like a Wildcat and expect superior results. You had to embrace its characteristics, build tactics around its strengths, accept its limitations. The limitation most difficult to accept was low-speed maneuverability. In turning fights below 300 miles per hour, the Zero retained its advantage. Its light wing loading, its highly responsive controls, allowed it to outturn anything the Americans flew. Corsair pilots who forgot this lesson, who allowed themselves to be drawn into slow-speed combat, paid for it. The airplane's heavy weight and higher wing loading meant it simply could not match the Zero's turn radius at low speeds. Walsh remembered this years later with brutal clarity. Of my 21 victories, 17 were against Zeros, and I lost 5 aircraft in combat. There were times that I tangled with a Zero at slow speed, one-on-one. In these instances, I considered myself fortunate to survive. Between April and August, VMF 124 and the other Corsair squadrons arriving in the Solomons refined their doctrine. Altitude, speed, disciplined attacks. No extended dogfights. Use the Corsair's advantages. Avoid situations that played to the Zero's strengths. It sounds obvious in retrospect, but in the moment, with adrenaline flooding your system, with tracers arcing past your canopy, with the natural fighter-pilot instinct to chase an enemy who had just tried to kill you, discipline was everything. The results became undeniable. By May, Walsh had 5 kills, making him the first Corsair ace. By August, he had 20. Other pilots were following similar patterns. The squadron's kill-to-loss ratio was improving dramatically, not because the Corsairs were suddenly different airplanes, but because their pilots had learned to fight in them correctly. On August 15, 1943, Walsh led his division against a Japanese formation outnumbering them 6-1. They were protecting Allied forces at Vella La Vella. Walsh dove his Corsair into the enemy formation repeatedly. His aircraft took numerous 20mm hits, including one in the starboard wing fuel tank. He shot down 2 dive bombers and a fighter before violent evasive action carried him into a cloud. Inside that cloud, his gyros tumbled. Vertigo. The Corsair exited the cloud inverted, in a 43-degree dive, heading directly for the crater of an extinct volcano on Kolombangara. Walsh pulled out at minimum altitude, barely missing the crater rim. He returned to base where his aircraft was declared a total loss. 2 weeks later, on August 30th, Walsh's Corsair developed engine trouble during an escort mission. He landed at the advanced strip at Munda, grabbed a replacement aircraft, and took off again to rejoin his flight over Kahili. Alone, separated from his formation, he encountered approximately 50 Japanese Zeros. He attacked. 4 Zeros fell before cannon fire forced him to ditch off Vella La Vella. These 2 missions earned Kenneth Walsh the Medal of Honor, but they also demonstrated something else, what the Corsair made possible. An American pilot, outnumbered 6-1, then 50-1, attacking rather than evading, surviving multiple engagements through superior aircraft performance and disciplined tactics, accumulating victories against an enemy who months before had dominated the Pacific skies. The Japanese noticed. They had to. The Corsair's arrival coincided with a shift in the air war's momentum. Through the summer and fall of 1943, Allied air superiority over the Solomons became undeniable. Rabaul, the major Japanese base at the north end of the slot, came under increasing pressure. Marine Corsair squadrons flew fighter sweeps deep into Japanese-controlled airspace, sometimes encountering resistance, sometimes finding empty skies because Japanese commanders had learned to avoid combat against the bent-wing birds when conditions did not favor them. The sound arrived first, that distinctive moan from the wing root intakes, audible on high-speed approaches. To Japanese soldiers on the ground, to pilots in vulnerable aircraft, the sound meant death was approaching fast. Whistling death entered the lexicon, a nickname that acknowledged both the airplane's acoustic signature and its lethal effectiveness. Japanese intelligence assessments began noting the Corsair as a particularly dangerous opponent. Part 2 of the script. By September 1943, a new squadron arrived in the Solomons that would transform the Corsair's reputation from effective to legendary. Marine Fighting Squadron 214 had been hastily assembled from replacement pilots, men awaiting squadron assignments, pilots between tours. They were orphans in the military bureaucracy, which earned them their first unofficial name, Boyington's Bastards. Their commander was Major Gregory. Boyington, a 31-year-old pilot whose age made him a decade older than most of his men. They called him Pappy. Boyington had already accumulated a controversial combat record. He had flown with the American volunteer group in China, the Flying Tigers, claiming 6 victories, though the exact number remained disputed. He had returned to the Marine Corps in 1942, served as executive officer of VMF 122 on Guadalcanal without scoring any kills, then commanded VMF 112 briefly before being given VMF 214. He was known for aggressive tactics, a disregard for authority, and an absolute confidence in his abilities that some found inspiring and others found insufferable. What made VMF 214 different was not just their commander's personality, but his philosophy about how to fight in Corsairs. Boyington had studied the lessons from VMF 124 and the other early squadrons. He understood the altitude advantage, the speed differential, the importance of disciplined boom and zoom attacks, but he added something else: deliberate provocation. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. On September 16, 1943, VMF 214 flew their third mission. 24 Corsairs climbed high above Balali Island at the southern end of Bougainville, escorting Navy dive bombers. But the Corsairs were not positioned as close escorts. They orbited well above 20,000 feet, almost detached from the bombers below. It looked like poor formation discipline. It looked like the fighters were more interested in their own survival than protecting the strike package. It was bait. Japanese commanders at Kahili and Balali launched 50 or more fighters to intercept the American bombers. The Zeros climbed toward what they believed was a vulnerable target, escorted by fighters too high and too far away to intervene effectively. Then the Corsairs dove. 24 bent-wing birds, building speed in the dive, came screaming down on the screaming Japanese formation. The engagement lasted minutes. The Corsairs destroyed multiple Japanese aircraft, damaged more, and broke away without loss. The Black Sheep, as they now called themselves in reference to their orphan status and their black sheep insignia, had announced their arrival. Over the next 84 days, VMF 214 would fly combat missions almost daily. They developed a pattern that maximized the Corsairs' advantages while exploiting Japanese tactical doctrine. Japanese fighters, particularly the veteran pilots still operating in late 1943, were aggressive. They would climb to meet American formations. They would accept combat even against superior numbers if they believed they could reach bombers or catch fighters at a disadvantage. Boyington used this aggressiveness against them. The Black Sheep would fly to Japanese airfields, orbit overhead at high altitude, and wait. Sometimes they would make strafing runs on the airfield itself, destroying aircraft on the ground, but more importantly, making noise, drawing attention, challenging the Japanese to come up and fight. When the Zeros launched, climbing slowly toward the Corsairs' altitude, the Americans had every advantage. They could choose when to engage, could dive with tremendous speed advantage, could fire their devastating .650 caliber armament into the climbing, relatively slow Japanese fighters, then zoom back to altitude before the more maneuverable Zeros could respond. It was warfare as calculated mathematics. The Corsairs' performance envelope versus the Zeros' capabilities translated into tactical geometry. Altitude equals potential energy. Speed equals kinetic energy. The Corsair could convert between them more efficiently than the Zero could. Stay high, build speed in the dive, use firepower and speed to kill, convert kinetic energy back to potential energy in the zoom climb, reset, repeat. Never give the Zero what it wanted, a slow speed turning. Fight where its light wing loading and responsive controls dominated. The results spoke for themselves. In their first 2 weeks, the Black Sheep shot down 23 Japanese aircraft with 11 more probable kills. 5 of their own pilots were lost. It was an exchange ratio that, if sustained, would be devastating to Japanese air strength in the region. But it could not be sustained indefinitely. Each mission meant hours at high altitude, high stress, constant vigilance. The physical and mental toll accumulated. Pilots lost weight. Exhaustion became chronic. Some developed what would later be called combat fatigue. Yet the missions continued. On October 4, 1943, Boyington escorted Douglas Dauntless dive bombers on a strike against Bougainville. In the space of 60 seconds, he shot down 3 Zeros. The kills were so rapid, so clinical, that they demonstrated how completely the tactical equation had shifted. A year earlier, the Zero had been the premier fighter in the Pacific. Now, American pilots in Corsairs were destroying them at a rate the Japanese could not sustain. The Japanese response revealed how profoundly the Corsair had altered their calculations. Intelligence reports from interrogated Japanese pilots after the war showed consistent themes. The Corsair was fast. The Corsair was heavily armed. The Corsair could not be caught in a dive. The Corsair pilots refused to fight at low speeds where the Zero's advantages mattered. Most significantly, Japanese pilots began avoiding combat against Corsairs when possible, looking for easier targets, withdrawing when the bent-wing birds appeared. This was not cowardice. It was rational tactical assessment. The Zero remained an excellent fighter within its performance envelope, against slower American types, against bombers. In situations where its maneuverability could be brought to bear, it was still deadly. But against Corsairs flown by pilots who understood their aircraft's capabilities, the odds had shifted decisively. The acoustic signature became psychological warfare, that whistling moan from the wing root intakes, audible during high-speed dives and approaches, preceded attacks. Ground forces learned to associate the sound with incoming strikes. The Corsair could carry bombs, up to 2,000 pounds on external racks, and increasingly it was being employed as a fighter bomber. 8 5-inch rockets could be mounted under the wings, devastating against ships, ground installations, and concentrated troop positions. The whistle meant death was coming, whether from guns, bombs, or rockets. Japanese propaganda tried to counter the Corsair's psychological impact. Articles in military publications emphasized the Zero's continued effectiveness, highlighted instances where Corsairs had been shot down, argued that American equipment advantages meant nothing against Japanese fighting spirit. But pilots who had faced Corsairs in combat knew better. Equipment advantages, when combined with sound tactics and adequate training, mattered enormously. By late October, Boyington had accumulated 20 victories. His score was climbing toward the American record of 26, held by Captain Joe Foss and tied by World War I ace Eddie Rickenbacker. The press attention intensified. War correspondents flew out to the Solomons to interview the colourful, quotable Marine major who led the Black Sheep. Stories appeared in newspapers across America. Boyington became famous, his squadron became famous, and the Corsair became famous with them. The aircraft itself continued evolving. The F4U-1A variant addressed some of the original model's limitations. The birdcage canopy was replaced with a blown plexiglass bubble canopy that significantly improved visibility. The engine was upgraded to the R2800-8W, producing 2,000 horsepower with water injection for emergency power, an additional 250 horses when needed most. These improvements made an already capable fighter even more deadly. But the most significant development was not technical, it was doctrinal. By November 1943, Corsair tactics had been systematized, written down, distributed to new squadrons arriving in theatre. Altitude superiority, speed management, disciplined boom and zoom attacks, no extended dogfighting. Use the Corsair's strengths, avoid the Zero's strengths. What VMF 124 had learned through trial and error, what the Black Sheep had perfected through aggressive application, now became standard doctrine. New pilots arriving in the Pacific, transitioning into Corsairs, received this accumulated wisdom. They were taught not just how to fly the machine, but how to fight in it. The learning curve that had cost lives in February and March was shortened. The kill-to-loss ratio improved further. The Corsair was no longer just a capable fighter, it was becoming the dominant fighter in the Pacific theatre. On November 26, 1943, the Black Sheep returned to Espiritu Santo for a week of rest between combat tours. A photographer arranged the squadron for publicity photos. They posed with baseball bats sent by the Street Louis Cardinals, a publicity stunt where the team had offered to trade caps for confirmed kills. Boyington sat in the cockpit of an F4U-1A, number 86, painted with 20 small Japanese flags representing his victories and the name Lulubelle on the fuselage. The photo would become iconic, though in reality Boyington rarely flew the same aircraft twice. It was a point of pride in the squadron that they shared aircraft, that no pilot had a personal mount, that the Black Sheep flew whatever Corsair was available. The second combat tour began in December. The missions grew more intense as Allied forces prepared for operations farther up the Solomons chain. The Black Sheep flew sweeps against Rabaul, the massive Japanese base that had been bypassed rather than assaulted directly. Rabaul remained a significant air threat, and neutralizing it required constant fighter sweeps to destroy Japanese aircraft and suppress their ability to interfere with Allied operations elsewhere. On December 23rd, Boyington's score reached 24, within 2 of the record. The press followed his progress obsessively. Headlines tracked each new victory. The United States needed heroes in late 1943, needed evidence that the long Pacific campaign was succeeding, needed symbols of American technological and tactical superiority over the enemy. Pappy Boyington and his Corsair provided that symbol. 4 days later, on December 27th, Boyington shot down another 0 over Rabaul. 25 confirmed victories, 1 away from tying the record. The pressure intensified. War correspondents speculated about when, not if, he would reach 26. VMF 214 was scheduled to complete their second combat tour in early January. Everyone understood Boyington would fly every mission until he either tied the record or the tour ended. What nobody understood, could not understand, was how the cumulative stress of 80-plus combat missions was affecting these pilots. Boyington had been putting tobacco in the corners of his eyes to stay alert during missions, fighting exhaustion with sheer willpower. The Corsair might be a superior machine, but it still required a functioning pilot, and pilots were not machines. They accumulated fatigue, stress, psychological wounds that were invisible but no less real. The morning of January 3, 1944, Boyington led a large fighter sweep to Rabaul. Mostly Marine Corsairs, including the Black Sheep, plus 16 Navy Hellcats. The sun was rising as they approached Simpson Harbor. Japanese fighters climbed to meet them. In the engagement that followed, Boyington shot down a 0, his 26th victory. He had tied the record. Then his Corsair took hits, cannon shells, 20mm, tearing into the aircraft. He went into the water off Rabaul. Captain George Ashmun, his wingman, also went down. Both pilots disappeared. Neither returned to base. The Black Sheep landed, claiming 7 victories total for the mission, but their commander was missing. 5 days later, VMF 214 concluded their second combat tour. The squadron was disbanded, the pilots reassigned to other units, and the legend began its transformation from immediate reality to historical memory. What the Black Sheep did not know, what America would not learn until war's end, was that Gregory Boyington had survived. A Japanese submarine had pulled him from the water. He would spend the remaining 20 months of the war in prisoner camps, enduring conditions that made combat seem preferable. But on January 3, 1944, as far as anyone knew, the Marine Corps had lost its most celebrated ace, the most celebrated Corsair pilot. The loss should have been devastating to morale. Instead, it became validation. Boyington had achieved 26 confirmed victories, possibly more. He would be awarded the Medal of Honor, initially believed posthumous. The Black Sheep's record, 97 confirmed air-to-air kills in 84 days of combat, 203 Japanese aircraft destroyed or damaged counting ground kills, stood as proof of what the Corsair made possible. Not immortality, not invulnerability, but a fundamental shift in the aerial combat equation that transformed American pilots from defensive survivors into offensive hunters. By early 1944, the Corsair's reputation was established throughout the Pacific. Japanese intelligence documents captured later in the war showed detailed analyses of the aircraft. They noted its speed advantage, approximately 100 miles per hour over the 0 in level flight. They documented its climb rate superiority, particularly above 15,000 feet where the Corsair's supercharged engine maintained power, while the 0's non-supercharged power plant began losing effectiveness. They acknowledged its devastating firepower, the 650 caliber machine guns that could destroy a 0 with a 2-second burst. Most significantly, Japanese tactical directives began advising pilots to avoid engagement with Corsairs unless circumstances were favorable. This represented a complete reversal from early war doctrine, when Japanese fighters would aggressively pursue any American aircraft. Now, they were being told to pick their battles, to withdraw when facing Corsairs that held altitude and speed advantages, to look for situations where their maneuverability could compensate for the Corsairs' other advantages. This shift in Japanese doctrine revealed something profound about the nature of air superiority. It was not simply about having better aircraft, though that mattered. It was not simply about having better pilots, though that mattered too. It was about creating conditions where the enemy could not fight effectively, even when they wanted to. The Corsair, flown according to the doctrine developed through 1943, created those conditions. Japanese pilots might have been willing to fight, might have retained their courage and skill, but they could not overcome the fundamental performance disadvantage the Corsair imposed. The statistical record compiled by war's end told the story in numbers that were almost difficult to believe. United States Navy and Marine Corps Corsair and Goodyear-built FG pilots flew 64,051 operational sorties. They claimed 2,140 air combat victories against 189 losses to enemy aircraft, an overall kill ratio of 11-1. Against the Zero specifically, the ratio was 12-1. Even against Japan's late-war advanced fighters, the Nakajima, Ki-84, and Kawanishi N-1KJ, both superior to the Zero in many respects, Corsairs maintained a 6-1 kill ratio. These numbers require context to understand their significance. The F-6F Hellcat, operating primarily from carriers and facing different operational conditions, achieved approximately 19-1. The Hellcat was an excellent fighter, perhaps easier to fly than the Corsair, certainly more forgiving for less experienced pilots. But the Corsair's 11-1 ratio was achieved while also serving extensively as a fighter-bomber, dropping 15,621 tons of bombs, 70% of all bombs dropped by United States fighters in the Pacific. The Corsair fought in both air superiority and ground attack roles, accumulated its kill ratio across the entire range of Pacific combat conditions, and maintained the lowest loss rate of any American fighter in the theater. What made these numbers possible was not just the aircraft, it was the system that had developed around the aircraft, the doctrine that told pilots how to fight, the maintenance that kept Corsairs flying despite primitive field conditions, the logistics that delivered fuel, ammunition, spare parts to forward bases, the training pipeline that produced pilots who understood the aircraft's capabilities before they reached combat, the intelligence that briefed pilots on enemy tactics and current threats. All of these elements, working together, created the conditions for the Corsair's success. But at the human level, at the level of individual pilots in individual aircraft, it remained brutally simple. Stay fast. Stay high. Use your advantages. A pilot who remembered these principles, who maintained discipline even in the chaos of combat, who resisted the temptation to dogfight, had excellent odds of survival and success. A pilot who forgot, who allowed a Zero to draw him into a slow-speed turning fight, faced very different odds. Kenneth Walsh, and the first Corsair ace, survived the war with 21 victories. He returned for a second combat tour in 1945, flying the improved F4U-4 from the Philippines and Okinawa. His final victory came on June 22, 1945, a kamikaze Zero shot down during the Battle of Okinawa. He retired as a lieutenant colonel after 28 years of service. When asked about his combat experience decades later, he consistently emphasized the same lessons. Altitude was paramount. Discipline was everything. The Corsair gave you advantages, but you had to use them correctly. By late 1944, the United States Navy finally cleared the Corsair for carrier operations. The Royal Navy had been operating Corsairs from carriers since mid-1943, having developed a curved approach technique that solved the visibility problems that had troubled American carrier trials. British modifications to the aircraft, including simple changes like wiring the cowl flaps shut to prevent oil from smearing the windscreen, had addressed many of the original concerns. When the United States Navy looked again at the Corsair, seeing both the British success and the desperate need for fighters to counter the kamikaze threat, the decision was made. Corsairs would go to sea. VMF 124, the original Corsair squadron, became the first Marine unit based on an aircraft carrier in December 1944, deploying aboard USS Essex. They were joined by VMF 213. These Marine Corsair squadrons, operating from carriers, faced a new mission: kamikaze interception. The desperate Japanese tactic of suicide attacks on American ships required fighters that could reach incoming kamikazes quickly, shoot them down before they could crash into their targets, and do so reliably in all weather conditions. The Corsair proved well suited to this mission. Its speed allowed rapid interceptions. Its climb rate meant it could reach altitude quickly when radar detected incoming raids. Its firepower could destroy an aircraft with a brief burst, critical when engagement times were measured in seconds. During the Okinawa campaign, Corsairs operating from carriers and from captured airfields on the island itself earned the nickname Angels of Okinawa for their success against the kamikaze threat. The technical evolution continued. The F4U-4, introduced in late 1944, represented the ultimate wartime Corsair. The R2800-18W engine produced 2450 horsepower with water injection, a 25% increase over the original -1. A four-bladed propeller replaced the original three-bladed design, more efficiently converting that power into thrust. The result was a fighter capable of 446 miles per hour at sea level, with a climb rate exceeding 4,000 feet per minute. It was faster than the original Corsair, climbed better, and maintained these advantages up to higher altitudes. Against late-war Japanese aircraft, the -4's performance advantages were even more pronounced. Japan's best fighters, the Ki-84 and N-1KJ, were formidable opponents, well-armed and maneuverable, but they still could not match the Corsair's speed, and speed remained the critical advantage. A Corsair pilot could always choose whether to fight, could always break away if the situation turned unfavorable, could always reset and attack again from an advantageous position. The Japanese fighters, despite their capabilities, could not prevent this. By the time Japan surrendered on September 2, 1945, the Corsair had fundamentally reshaped the Pacific Air War. The aircraft that the Navy had rejected for carrier operations in 1942 had become one of the war's most successful fighters. The Marines who had received it as a consolation prize had transformed it into a weapon that symbolized American air superiority. The tactics developed through hard experience in 1943 had become doctrine that made those 11-to-1 kill ratios possible. For Japanese pilots who survived the war, the Corsair remained a subject of respect bordering on fear. Post-war interviews revealed consistent themes. The Corsair was the most difficult American fighter to engage. Its speed made it almost impossible to catch. Its firepower made even glancing hits potentially fatal. Its pilots, by late war, fought with a discipline that denied Japanese fighters the opportunity to use their maneuverability advantages. Some Japanese pilots, when asked what American fighter they would least want to face, named the Corsair without hesitation. This assessment vindicated the design philosophy that had created the aircraft: build the smallest airframe around the most powerful engine, accept the resulting complications in carrier operations, trust that performance advantages would matter more than ease of operation. The Navy's initial rejection had been reasonable given their criteria, but the Marines' adoption and the subsequent operational experience proved that raw performance, properly exploited, could dominate aerial combat. The Corsair's story did not end with the Japanese surrender. The aircraft continued production until 1952, with over 12,000 built. It served in the Korean War, where Marine and Navy Corsair squadrons flew close air support missions, ground attack strikes, and occasional air-to-air combat. On September 10, 1952, Captain Jesse Folmar of Marine Fighter Squadron 312 shot down a MiG-15 jet fighter while flying an F4U-4 Corsair. A propeller-driven aircraft from the previous war's technology generation had destroyed a modern jet fighter. It was the Corsair's final air-to-air victory, a fitting end to a combat career that had begun 9 years earlier over Guadalcanal. The legacy extended beyond American service. Corsairs equipped the Royal Navy, Royal New Zealand Air Force, French Aéronavale, and other Allied air forces. Some remained in frontline service until the late 1950s. The final combat missions flown by Corsairs occurred during the 1969 football war between Honduras and El Salvador, a quarter-century after the type's combat debut. It was an extraordinary service life for an aircraft design that originated in 1938. Today, the Corsair remains one of the most recognizable aircraft of World War II. Its distinctive inverted gull wing, its massive radial engine, its bent-wing bird silhouette are instantly identifiable. Air shows feature Corsairs, demonstrating the power and performance that made them legends. Museums display them as centerpieces of their World War II collections, and historians study them as examples of how technology, tactics, and human factors combine to create military effectiveness. But the true measure of the Corsair's impact was written in the skies over the Pacific between 1943 and 1945. It was written in the tactical doctrines Japanese commanders issued, telling their pilots to avoid engagement when possible. It was written in the 11-to-1 kill ratio that represented not just superior aircraft, but superior system integration of machines, tactics, training, and logistics. It was written in the transformation of American fighter doctrine from defensive survival to offensive dominance. When Kenneth Walsh climbed into his Corsair on February 13th, 1943, heading toward what would become the St. Valentine's Day massacre, neither he nor anyone else could have predicted how completely the aircraft would transform Pacific air combat. The disaster of that first mission should have ended the Corsair's combat career. Instead, it began a process of tactical innovation and doctrinal evolution that turned difficult, dangerous aircraft into the most effective fighter in the Pacific theater. The Japanese pilots who faced Corsairs came to understand, through bitter experience, that the bent-wing bird changed everything. Its whistle announced death. Its speed denied them the ability to dictate combat terms. Its firepower destroyed their aircraft with brief bursts. Its pilots, by mid-war, fought with a discipline that exploited every advantage the machine offered. The 11-to-1 kill ratio was not accident or luck. It was the inevitable result of superior performance married to sound tactics, executed by adequately trained pilots, supported by effective logistics. This was what shocked Japanese pilots about the F4U Corsair. Not that America had built a good fighter. They had faced good American fighters before. What shocked them was confronting a fighter that made their own aircraft's advantages irrelevant. The Zero's maneuverability meant nothing when Corsairs refused to turn. Japanese pilot skill meant nothing when the engagement geometry prevented them from bringing guns to bear. Fighting spirit meant nothing when the material performance gap could not be overcome through courage alone. The Corsair proved that in modern warfare, technology matters, tactics matter, training matters, logistics matter, and when all these elements align, when a capable aircraft is flown according to doctrine that maximizes its advantages, supported by adequate maintenance and supply, operated by pilots who understand both the machine and the mission, the results can be devastating. 11-to-1, 2,140 kills against 189 losses, numbers that represented not just victories, but a fundamental shift in the balance of air power that helped win the Pacific War. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.